Hello there. Happy Monday.
I think you're on mute.
There we go. Hi, Ms. Bentley.
Hello,
How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good. Glad to.
I was thinking about the assignments we were just discussing and property and the MERS litigation. that was covered in the- I imagine there'll be quite a bit of that.
There will be quite a bit of that. Love the thing you sent to me, by the way.
Oh,
Interesting
great.
article. We've been covering some of the COVID litigation in property that's already coming, that's already come out, but it was wonderful to see that one.
I
It's,
thought that was,
it's fascinating.
yeah.
It's going to be the start of a tidal wave. Hi, Mr. Gower. Hi, Mr. Westerman.
Hi, Professor Rayhan. How are you?
Fine, thanks. And you?
I'm doing well,
Good.
as well as I can be, at least.
Yeah, I know. It's a tough time. Someone asked me last night on the phone how my weekend went. If I could have jumped through the phone and squeezed their neck, I would.
Swiftly.
Like, what a weekend. Especially now that we're at home all the time. It all seems to meld in together. Hi, Ben. Hi, Ted.
Hello.
Hello. You always look you look like a DJ.
I'm assuming that's a good thing, right?
It is.
Although, Ted, I would say that, in this modern era, I feel like there should be less wires going on.
I know.
The wireless era.
Fair point, Jeff. My earbuds don't connect to my law school machinery,
Yeah, mine don't either. That's
right?
why-
And for what it's worth, I have had this set up since probably since I went to law school.
Yeah, so that's all good. It's all good. We have to get you a set of the Bose noise canceling.
Well, I've got those big head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rosemary's seen me in the library all the time with those things. They're designed to say, "Don't bother me."
Yeah.
Yeah, I have the corded ones that I use on airplanes.
Yeah, mine are corded too. Hi, Mr. Walker.
Hello, everyone. I need to step away to get myself some lunch. I'll be right back.
No worries. Get me some too, please.
It might take a little bit.
Yeah.
My food delivery service is all out of whack with the coronavirus.
Yeah. Hi, Dean Queenan.
Hi,
How are you?
thank you for doing this.
It's our pleasure. It should be really interesting. I'll be a lot calmer when our speaker arrives.
Oh, yeah. Do you, Pat, do you want to send an email reminder, or shall I do that?
Can you do it? Do you
Yeah,
mind?
sure. Yeah, of course.
Here she is.
Okay, there we go. Great. Yeah.
Yay.
Hello, hello.
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 You all set?
All set whenever you are. Look, everyone's here. This is great.
It's wonderful. We'll have a lot of people joining in and out. And as you can expect, starting at about 10 to 1, people will start to depart.
I would
Great.
assume.
1 o'clock classes and all that sort of thing. So Ted, you want to get us started generally and then I'll come back?
Yes. Yeah, let's rock and roll. So we have, I'm just doing a quick,
We are recording, just so you guys know.
so we have 12:01 on our time. And so we're going to welcome everyone to the first First Mondays, the first Monday in May of 2020. For folks who are getting ready to graduate, we are thrilled on your upcoming achievement, and for folks who are finishing the semester, congrats on getting to this point. You have exams and you have final papers and other work over the next couple weeks that you're going to focus on, but we're really excited about First Mondays and continuing it in the virtual way that we are. And just a quick note about First Mondays: it's opportunity for focus on business, and so business and politics drive the law. The conversations that we've had over the past 2 semesters have been cutting edge topics through a legal lens. And we're great. We're thrilled to have the great energy that we've had from the students who are here, and as well as faculty and staff. So I'm gonna, without further ado, I'm gonna hand things over to Professor Pat Rayhan to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Ted, and welcome all of you. I see a lot of familiar faces from First Monday. I'm hoping there's some admitted students and other guests who are here as well. We're very proud of this program, in part because it's a collaboration of students and faculty and guests, and we have respect for each other and respect for each other's view, and we have the chance to really step back, as Professor DeBarbieri says, step back from our role as lawyers in an isolated venue, if you will, and look at the way in which law intersects with all sorts of things going on in our lives. And obviously the current crisis makes that even more manifest. So we're very, very fortunate to have with us today Professor Dr. Alexandra Harrington. Professor Harrington, Dr. Harrington is a member of the faculty of Albany Law School. She is also an expert on Indigenous rights, on threats to Indigenous rights, and on sustainability generally. She is literally world renowned for her work. I have her curriculum vitae in front of me. If I read even a portion of it, I would take too much time away from the subject. But let's just say we are extraordinarily proud of her, not only because she's on our faculty, but because she's a graduate of our law school, having gotten both a JD and an LLM. Since then, she has gotten a doctorate of civil law from the McGill University in Montreal, Canada. She has done an amazing amount of work in Canada, which I'm sure that I hope that she will talk to you about. And then she is the author of a couple of books on her own, the co-author of many books. She has written articles across the sustainability landscape with respect to Canada, with respect to the US, with respect to the world. We are so delighted that she's our colleague and our teacher and our friend, and particularly delighted that she's our guest on First Mondays today. So, Dr. Harrington.
Thank you so much, Professor Rayhan. Thank you, Professor DeBarbieri. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to join us on Monday, and especially on the last Monday of the academic year. We made it. I don't know how, but we made it. So this is very good. So thank you all for coming. I actually recognize some of the names I was looking at as either current students or incoming students. So I'm so glad to have you here. It's such an incredible program, and it's wonderful to be a part of. And thank you for not reading the CV. Thank you very much, Professor Rayhan. I appreciate that. I hate looking at it. Anyway, so what I will be talking about today is it's a cross section. It's an overarching attempt to build a bridge. And it's a discussion of how we look at media portrayals of Indigenous communities, both in the US and in Canada, and also how we look at portrayals of now the COVID crisis and what the world might look like when COVID is over, again, in the US and Canada and globally, to see where we have been with the Indigenous communities, what lessons we can see in them now during the pandemic, and then what the possibilities will be going forward. And certainly, many of the perspectives that we will have coming out of this are easily translatable to other vulnerable or other minority communities. And we do definitely see in the US and in Canada and other communities that are releasing a lot more numbers about their minority populations, that there are many disparities that are really playing into these numbers. So it's important for us to to step back from what we think we know from the media and understand what the legal perspective is underneath all of this. And so that's why I was so thrilled to have this idea brought to me. So really thank you for allowing me to talk about it. I think just a minute or two of background about the work that I have done in Canada to give you some perspective of it. Indigenous issues were actually first really of interest to me in my PhD thesis, and it was on territory and sovereignty. So it was actually a really like property-based thesis idea, and looking at the relationships over time, and naturally Indigenous communities came to be a part of this. So obviously the US was one of my case studies, but so was Canada, as well as Australia and New Zealand. And when I graduated, I came to Albany Law. I taught at Albany Law previously, and then was here as an adjunct for a while. And I had the opportunity to go back to Canada as a Fulbright scholar for 2 years. So to be the Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Global Governance, which I still technically hold, and apparently I always hold. I don't know why, I just do. Anyway, I don't need another name or a title, but there you go. And in that capacity, I've actually had the chance to engage on a project that is becoming now funded by the Canadian government for a multiple year segment. It had only been about a year and a half. That looks at different disparities from a legal perspective in Indigenous communities in Canada, especially those that have treaties, which I'll talk about momentarily, with the actual Canadian state itself. So it's a really interesting topic. It's a very timely topic, not only for COVID, but even before COVID, because these discussions are coming up much more. And because we tend to assume often that there's a unitary lens when we talk about Indigenous communities. So they're the same wherever they are, the issues are the same, the regulations are the same. It does tend to help to have a perspective on the US and Canada, because we are neighbors, we are friends, we are cousins, we share maple syrup and a love of maple syrup and hockey. Okay, I lived in Canada too long, and I think now I like hockey. It's just like a problem. It just gets into your mind. But we also have many legal similarities and differences. And that's, I think, the first thing that we need to talk about today, to set out some of this before we go any further. And the first area where we see terminology differences tend to come up in the idea of what we call Indigenous communities themselves. So for those of us who are working in the American context, you're used to hearing about Native American communities or Indigenous communities, and that is legally what we refer to these communities as. If you go to Canada, if you cross over into Montreal to visit for some poutine, you will discover references to First Nations communities. And this is the Indigenous community terminology. It is fiercely protected. It is very much valued as First Nations, on an argument that these are nations, they always have been nations legally as well as societally, and that they are thus required to be acknowledged as such, not just as communities. So they are First Nations. Some are recognized, some are not. We'll talk about that in a moment. But they do exist as that, and to call them anything else is legally and factually wrong. There is one other distinction that we don't have in the US legally that is used in Canada, and that is the idea of a Métis population. It's METIS. And Métis is a population of Indigenous origin, so First Nation community origin, that has typically moved into a city. So it can be an entire group, or it can be a subgroup. And then they have moved into a city, often into Montreal or parts of Ontario, sometimes parts of Vancouver. And they have a special status. So they're not technically regarded as solely being Canadian. They do have a special status, but they're not living within their traditional community, so they don't enjoy all of those rights. This becomes very important when we talk about the rights that are due to them in situations like COVID, because they very much occupy a gray zone that law has basically kind of left on its own. So that's a very important terminology for us to understand. In terms of reservations, unfortunately, both countries have them. When we say reservation, it does mean the same thing. And in both countries, you have communities that are located on territories that weren't necessarily theirs to begin with. So they were pushed off. And in the Canadian case, they were pushed not only off, but also up into the Arctic, especially in the 1950s, in an attempt to ground claims to the Arctic that that Canada wanted to make. They were afraid of Russians coming over and no one knowing, because the caribou are really not an effective line of defense. So they put First Nations communities there to lay their sovereign claim and also be able to actually communicate and say, you know, we see Russians coming over the hill. This was why, but this is not actually a place you want to live. Really wasn't. So, but they're still there. The other things, two other things from a legal perspective to know. One is the concept in Canada of a historical versus a modern treaty, because they're not all the same. More in a minute, but just to have your ears kind of listening for. And finally, the idea of reconciliation, which is a very big issue more in Canada than the US right now. Both Canada and the US used in the 1950s through to the 1970s, and in some parts even 1980s in Canada, what they called the residential school systems, where Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed in government-run or religious-run facilities that we have come to know now are were quite horrible in terms of how they actually treated the children, treated their heritage, and the abuses committed in them were really horrible, horrifying. As a result of this, Canada has actually had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission come out, and they spent years creating very well researched, very well written. Do not read them during exams, students, because you will be completely miserable and depressed, and you don't know, you need positive reading right now. But they are very important to understand. And they give a context and a framework. They've come out in the past several years, and they really give a framework for how Canada is now trying to implement the legal rights of First Nations communities, not only as members of Canadian society, but also in a way almost as a retributive effect, and trying to reconcile what was done in the past, and actually putting the onus on every Canadian that it's not just, you know, maybe we weren't here, maybe my family only came over from somewhere in the, you know, the 1980s, 1990s, we had nothing to do with it, but the idea is that every Canadian, by being Canadian, is in some way involved. And it's a very different legal and mental system than what we have here, and mentality than what we have here, in the sense of it's really something we don't talk about to the same extent legally or historically. So I raise it because it has a much more nuanced sensitivity. But those are the main terms. There's not a quiz, don't worry students, there's not a quiz at the end. But when we think about the first encounters with Indigenous communities and settlers, either French or some Dutch, but largely British settlers, especially in the eastern part of the US and into Canada, we think of smallpox, we think of truly horrific events. We don't necessarily discuss the legal aspects, which were in many ways completely unequal, but they still did exist as such. And they set basically what the system that we have in place in both locations is today. You will remember from con law, especially students who are first years, you will remember from con law that there is a line in the US Constitution about the tribes, and Congress having negotiation abilities with the tribes because they are regarded as being sovereign, and they always were, in the sense that they're sovereign within the territory of the US. It doesn't mean that they have the right to go outside of the US to negotiate for international treaties or negotiate as their own entities, as the Navajo, for example, to sign up to the World Trade Organization, but they do have within their relationship with the government a different standing. The same is true in Canada, and this actually comes from the same Royal Proclamation from the 1700s that was signed by England in place in the colonies. So at that time, Canada and the US were called colonies, regarding how everyone dealt with Indigenous communities. Now, what's interesting is that when we had the American Revolution, that proclamation kept on and was used as how the US dealt with everyone. So how everyone, all the tribes that were discovered, and I use that term truly in air quotes, as we moved west, were dealt with in the same way in terms of having a treaty, which ultimately was a very unequal treaty, but having a treaty and being required to have a treaty with the US government, often at the point of a gun. What's interesting is that Canada didn't use that same system. So from the point of basically Ontario going west, there was not the requirement to use the same system. And as a result now, you will see that there are approximately 50-ish, if you count the ones currently being negotiated, treaties in place between tribes, specific tribes, and the Canadian government. That is not all the tribes in Canada. There are many, there are hundreds, but many don't actually have these agreements and many don't want them. And so many are on land that is recognized as theirs, although they don't have an official treaty with the Canadian government. One of my very dear friends is actually the daughter of a tribal chief of the Ahousaht, who are on Victoria Island by Vancouver. And they are very fierce in that they do not want a treaty. They want all of their resources, their timber, their land, etc., to be negotiated for. Should the government want them? Should a private entity want them? They want them all to be negotiated for separately and not as part of some larger treaty that would require a greater deal of compromise. So they are very much vocal about this, at the same time that many communities, especially those that don't have those types of resources, are still actively trying to become affiliated with the government in some way. So it's fascinating to see this, because this sets up how these communities have been treated and how they have historically existed for health purposes and for rights purposes. And I should mention at any point, if anyone has questions or wants to ask something, please, I take questions happily. I enjoy them. So if you want to ask, just ask. I'm not offended. And yes, those are golf clubs in the back. I couldn't get my husband to move them out in time. So they are golf clubs right over there. And yes, I do have random stuffed animals that goes with the theme. Anyway, he never uses them. That's why they're up here. Anyway.
Good social distancing activity.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Go out on your own. No forcing them. Just go out on your own and play golf. It's brilliant. We can play it and could remember. But when we talk about kind of the pre-pandemic situation, in both the US and in Canada, there are special services, special health services, and special rights owed to communities that are Indigenous communities. In Canada, it is a branch of the National Health Service, because obviously Canada has a nationalized health system. The US does not. So it comes from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and from, which is an unfortunately named entity, but that is what it's named, and it's continued to be named that. And so that form of federal funding is available for those who live on reservations in the US and who seek medical care. Unfortunately, in both communities, both north and south of the border, it is very much an unequal healthcare system. You will see in both places, particularly in Canada, a lot of medical students who wish to have their loans, their medical school loans forgiven, actually doing service programs to go to, for example, the very northern communities in Nunavut or in the Northwest Territories, and live there for several years as basically like a hardship posting almost, and then they will have their loans forgiven. Typically, these are places where there's maybe one flight in and one flight out a week. So you maybe get home, you maybe don't. And if there's a snowstorm, you are not going home for Christmas. I knew someone whose cousin did that he was one of my doctoral friends at McGill, and his cousin, I think she was there for 3 years, went home once. And that was it, because she kept planning and then she just couldn't in and out with the snow. But these are very, very remote territories, and they're very hard to access on a good day, let alone on a bad day. And this means economically, obviously, it's very hard and it's very challenging. But socially, it's very difficult, and health-wise, it is very hard. And you see often in these communities in the US and in Canada, some of the highest maternal mortality rates. You see very high infant mortality rates. You see a lot of drug addiction, alcohol addiction, et cetera, all of which, as we now know, tend to start setting people up for the underlying factors that can exacerbate COVID or any other major outbreak. Right before the pandemic, so actually about 2.5 weeks before the pandemic, I was in Canada And the biggest story there was the attempt to develop the Wet'suwet'en area pipeline. And I was telling Professor Rayhan about this, and we were laughing because you will understand this all from property, but as you're well aware, the subsurface rights for those who own a territory belong to the people who own the territory. And there's this pipeline company that wanted to go through the Wet'suwet'en territories. The community didn't want them there. And they said, oh, that's fine. We're not going on your territory. We're going under your territory. So we don't have to come on. We don't have to bring a bulldozer. We will remove nothing, but we will go underneath. And so you're fine. We don't need to consult with you. And they actually had some of the tribal elders. And in most of the communities in Canada and the US, you have hereditary chiefs, and you also have those who are elected. So the chiefs that are hereditary basically descend from some of the much older chiefs. And these types of positions hold a great deal of authority and a great deal of clout, and sometimes they have political and sometimes they don't, but political abilities, and sometimes they don't. In this instance, they did. And so the tribal chiefs were actually able to sign off on this agreement despite the community being up in protest about this and ultimately up in arms about this. I distinctly remember this. First of all, I know a lot of people in these communities, and so I was talking to them about it, but also I was sitting in Toronto waiting to fly to Montreal in a snowstorm on the world's smallest plane. I mean, it looked like a 1940s plane coming out of like Casablanca or something. It was just tiny, tiny little thing. And everyone was completely, stunned because we were watching the news, and there was this news about how all the train traffic basically from Montreal going west had been disrupted as a result of these protests. And a lot of union workers and a lot of other workers who never really had much of sympathy for any type of Indigenous community before now were, because they were starting to understand the real danger of these types of arguments. And the real specious nature of these arguments. So you started to see people coming together slowly around this issue. At the same time that in the US, you had all the issues with the pipelines, and the idea, pipelines are very divisive, they really are. And the idea of coming onto, not only coming onto the territory to build pipelines, but coming on over the objection of those who live there, often onto territory that has a grounding in ceremony and religious belief, and putting something in place underground that could cause a great deal of damage for long and short term. So these were the types of issues that we were seeing. It was really an economic argument, economic focus on either side with a cultural perspective. And then it all stopped. And then everything changed, the world changed. All of a sudden, I couldn't be sitting in the airport in Montreal anymore. We couldn't be anywhere. We could be flying, and now we're all home. And it's very easy to go from that media focus on Indigenous communities and the outrage of what was trying to be taken away from them, to focusing on the disease and leaving them out of the conversation, which has largely been what's happened. And I was floored. I was floored yesterday because I was trying to get the latest statistics for those who've been confirmed tested positive for COVID in Canada and the US in Indigenous reservation areas. It's truly frightening. Now, please remember, there are 36 million people in Canada. Thus far, they have only provided 12 communities with tests. And of those 12, 3,600 have tested positive. That was in the US. In Canada, 138 were confirmed. That's actually not possible. It's literally not possible. But the tests are not being made available. There are many people who are being considered to have died of other causes, underlying causes, pneumonia, et cetera, not properly been reported on. But these types of focuses are now leaving the overall media attention. And everyone is focusing on the larger cities, the larger issues, the vaccines, whether we should use Lysol to disinfect, ourselves. Should we have a Tide Pod to make us all feel better? No, you shouldn't. But these types of issues are really taking away from those communities that are often suffering, and often are not going to be included in the post-pandemic response as well. And what we see is not only a kind of a failure of media, but especially for those of you who are law students, something to think of here is that we're seeing a failure of law to be applied. And when we look at the laws that do exist, there are obviously basic rights of citizens in both countries, because all members of Indigenous communities, no matter what community, are members of the citizenry of the US or Canada. They're all owed those fundamental rights. In addition, under the agreements that exist both with the US government and the tribes, as unequal as they often are, and between Canada and the tribes that have actually signed on, as well as through the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There is no Bill of Rights in Canada. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is essentially its closest analog, if you will, but it's still not that old and still not that entrenched. I mean, it's the best that they have, but still, it's a different system. But all of these rights are due to all citizens, and certainly not being given under the treaty obligations, as well as under the actual obligations to each citizen. So part of the work that I have been working on and focusing on is doing an analysis of treaties to look at how the treaties between the Canadian government and the different Indigenous communities provide for ways to fulfill the International Sustainable Development Goals, and to not only fulfill national law, but also assist Canada in fulfilling its international obligations, or certainly not being able to be penalized for not meeting them. And a takeaway that I think we need to think about post-pandemic, now that you have some understanding of how these relationships work in the larger context in each country, is that there is a big space for us when we talk about the pandemic recovery and reintegration, and how we reintegrate these communities. And everyone, ourselves, when can I go to Starbucks and just sit there and listen to the Starbucks music and, have my hair smell like coffee after several hours of joy and caffeinated bliss. But still, when we reintegrate, these are amazing opportunities, not only for us to remember that we really do like each other and we want to see each other again, and to find the world outside of our cul-de-sac, for example, but also to find ways to bring in communities that may have been marginalized already, and get past that as a matter of law, and get past that in terms of funding, get past that in terms of, for example, many efforts now to focus on renewable energy sources, and make, not as much in the US, but certainly in Canada, making whatever aid is given to the economy and the energy sector in the economy tied to renewable energy sources, many of which in the Canadian context are found on, or could be located on, Indigenous community territory. So there's a real chance to involve these communities a lot more, and to give them more of a voice and more of an opportunity. So certainly there is a lot of fear right now in these communities. I did talk to some people last night who I knew, just to get perspectives. And there is a lot of fear of what this could bring from a medical point of view. But there is also a great deal of hope, especially for those who are on both sides of the border, who are working in the legal field, that this type of event, which shows kind of the universal nature of something like a pandemic, can actually be used to then help everyone understand what their rights are as Canadians, as Americans, as Indigenous, as non-Indigenous, and be able to apply them for the benefit of Indigenous communities, but then also for other minorities as well. So it's 12:30. I don't want to go over time too much, because I really would love questions. If you don't have any, I could talk forever. Everyone who knows me knows this, but that was the brief overview I wanted to give you all, just to get a sense. Again, it's hard to talk about a lot of these things in a pandemic, because you're not focused on it.
Can I
So
jump in, Alex? And
anything.
I don't know how to raise my hand. I guess I'm a co-host in that. That makes it,
I don't know if you can when you're the co-host.
yeah, it could, I just get to be the boss, so I don't.
I think that's the privilege. Is it just, you don't need to.
In terms of the disease aspect of
Yeah.
this, Canada is a little bit different, I think, than the US in that you have something closer to universal health insurance and universal health coverage there. But from what you're saying, you know, it's the legal right and then there's the practical reality of it. And so do you, and let me add one more thing and then ask the question. I'm also curious as to whether you have Canada, since Canada has been much more sensitive to Aboriginal and First Nation rights, if you have less of the victim blaming in Canada that you're seeing in the US, where you know, the Navajo population, African American populations, that sort of thing, there's this sense of, well, they brought it on themselves. They're comorbidities and that sort of thing without a deep dive into why they have the comorbidities. So just from a comparative standpoint, how is Canada different in this crisis with the national health care, and how is their view, particularly with respect to victim blaming in general?
That's an excellent question. I think the view is very different. It's very different because of the truth and reconciliation aspects that I had mentioned earlier, because had this happened 10 years ago, it might be very different and you might see something much more like the US where you see a victim blaming. But now there's such a widespread understanding, and children, as soon as they're deemed old enough to read it, because honestly, it's a very rough read. If you read the full unredacted report, it's a very rough read. But once everyone has to read it in school at some point and really understand it and learn about it. And then when they do, it does kind of cut away a lot of that sense of other. And it makes people understand why the communities are the way they are towards non-Indigenous communities, why there is that hostility and that fear. Because there still is a lot of fear, especially even in the national health example. There's a lot of fear, especially the older generation, having seen their children go to residential schools or having gone to residential schools themselves. There's a lot of fear and distrust just inherent in whatever the government is bringing. And I think one of the real tests for this will be when there is a vaccine, what the reaction is within the community, because there is a potential for, especially if it's not well tested before it gets to them, for seeing themselves as guinea pigs and as, you know, potentially not as valuable as other Canadians, as is the case in the US. Obviously, there's the potential for that too. But I think because Canada has already gone through such a reckoning with its past, they're able to move on from the victim blaming as much. Does it go on? Yes, of course, it goes on everywhere. It's an unfortunate reality. In Canada, as in the US, it's much more targeted towards Asian communities now. But yeah.
Interesting. And you have the additional, as you say, you have that classic and understandable mistrust that's true in the US as well, that marginalized populations not only were harmed by, I can use Peru as a weird example.
No, absolutely.
The Incan civilization gets wiped out by smallpox. You wait four centuries later, and the Peruvian population gets wiped out by being the subjects of tests of vaccines that we were allowed to test on our own people. And so you can sure understand that distrust of
Absolutely.
recommended.
No, absolutely. And it's, you know, it's heartbreaking in many respects, because you do know that some people will choose not to take something that is potentially beneficial for them. At the same time, it's completely understandable. And many also would like to incorporate a lot more traditional medicine. And as much as there hasn't been this type of strain before, at least in healing of lungs and of a lot of the byproducts from the disease, there should be a place for traditional medicine. It is under the ways that the health system is usually put in place in the self-government aspect of the Canadian agreements. It's actually a bit easier to entrench that, because most of them have a requirement that there's at least like a 50-50 control over what type of healthcare is available within the different territories. So there is a way to make it a little bit more facilitative, but it's still a very important issue.
We have two people with their hands up, Mr. Benjamin first, and then Professor Buffington, please.
And we have one question
And
over
we do have a
chat.
question. Yes.
So maybe Benjamin Buffington and Zena Zimmerglass has a question over chat.
Sure.
Hi. I came a little. I apologize if my question is already addressed, but on the U.S. side, the coronavirus or the bills to help the nation did carve out some funding for tribal nations, and I was wondering if you seen or evaluated whether those funds have gone to tribal nations, and if there was also structures in place to help them procure testing or other resources needed.
So the funds are starting to go to the tribal nations. They go first to the designated heads of the nations, and then the nations will wind up parceling them out accordingly. The concern is always that it will go to cover a larger, for example, casino or something like that, as opposed to actually going to the small indigenous businesses who very much need them. And that level of oversight is difficult to enforce because of the way that the treaties have been written in. But it has started to flow to the tribes, and then we'll see where it winds up going in the ultimate reporting requirement. In terms of testing, there's no specific effort to assist any more than any other community is getting. And there's been no push to really test, either in the US or Canada, to test as much as is needed by the percentage of population. Amongst any community in any territory, it just really hasn't been that much of a priority. Again, these are subgroupings of a federal payment system and a federal control system. Even for those who are in the US, they basically have an equivalent of a federal health plan anyway, something like you would have if you were working for the US government or in the military, but not quite to the same caliber. So and you do have the option of having private insurance if you want, but most reservation doctors won't take that. So it becomes a bit more challenging. So it's not been done well, I guess is the best answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I recognize Mr. Benjamin from class last semester. Good to hear you.
Professor Buffington?
Thank you. I'm not sure. I believe that was me that inadvertently shared the screen with everyone. So if you all saw a flash of an email, I apologize for that. I can show you how to edit out. I was actually reaching for the Manage Participants a tab that happens to be unfortunately right next to the Share Screen tab. And I'm so used to sharing my screen with my students, I went in the wrong direction. Anywho, I actually do have a question that's probably just off the agenda, but I thought I'd go ahead and ask. So my PhD is in linguistics, and I wrote a dissertation about language and law, in particular about contract formation. Essentially, it was the first step in building an artificial intelligence that could recognize that a contractual offer had been laid on the table. Why am I mentioning that? Because one of the things that linguists really care about is understanding what it means to know language as a human being, not just as a speaker of English. So for example, exotic example, but in English, you can't ask the following question. Who do you believe the rumor that Joe kissed? Where the nature of the question is supposed to be something like, I know you believe a rumor that Joe kissed someone, I just don't know who that someone is, can you tell me? There are some languages that can. And so if we were to lose 5,000 languages and have only a few thousand languages left, and we were trying to model human language just on the basis of what we could say in English, then we would be losing things, right? We would not be actually modeling human language, we would just be modeling English. So linguists who do what I do, we care a lot about preserving indigenous language, endangered languages, but also obviously just from a human point of view, right? Tragically, there are some people who are now the only native speakers left on the planet of their indigenous languages. So my question, and I'm sorry for such a long setup, but my question is, what role does the law play, or can the law play, in the preservation of endangered indigenous languages?
It's such an awesome point. Thank you for bringing it up, because it's something that we don't usually talk about. And actually, it's something that I have done a lot of work on, again, in the context of the research in Canada and the SDGs. The law can do a lot, and it does, in certain instances, do a lot to entrench the preservation of the language, to entrench the preservation of the culture. Many of the treaties, especially the ones that have happened, say, from like the early 2000s onwards, in Canada, have actually entrenched an education right to learn in your own language as well as in English or French or both, because Canada is bilingual. Legally, everything must be in English and French. Presumably you all know that because most of you have been there, but still it is a legal requirement. But in territories that have heavy certain linguistic concentration, so heavily Haussit, for example, or heavily the Yukon, for example, has about 5 or 6 different languages that are all coming from the same core and then are all slightly different. There are tribal contracts and tribal treaties, as well as provincial laws that also require that instruction be given in these languages, that funding actually be given for members of the community to go to university and learn how to teach these languages, not just as a traditional practice, but also as a pedagogical point of view. And that these are kept very sacred. They're incorporated into many different aspects of contracts even. For example, the friend of mine who is the daughter of the tribal chief asked me to help her with a contract recently. So I was looking at the contract and it's in English and in Haussit because they want the understandings to be exactly the same and mirror images. And obviously I could not help her with the Haussit portion, but sadly I have many language skills. That's not one of them. But it really does show you how in contracting, but also just in how we create a school system and also how we create a medical system, right? Because for a lot of people, especially the elderly in a community, that is what they're most comfortable in. And when they feel vulnerable, that's what they will revert back to, is their own traditional language. You think about what you speak at home. Even if you move, you go somewhere else, you might speak something outside, but when you come home, that's your comfort and that's how you best express yourself. So even from a medical perspective, there is an attempt to really incorporate and train doctors who are in those territories in Canada as to how to work in the languages, at least to understand basic medical terminology. That was a great question. Thank you, Joe.
Dr. Harrington, we have a question
Yes.
from
Zena.
student Zena Zimmerglass.
Yeah.
And I'll just read it. Just as I said, about a lot of what we've been hearing is disease coming into Indigenous communities. I think Zena's wondering, are Indigenous communities ever protected at all from widespread infectious diseases due to existing isolation?
Absolutely. And Zena, it's great to see you, or at least see your name. She was in my class last year. So I miss all my students when they leave. It's really sad. It does make me happy to see you again. Might not make you happy to see me, but it always makes me happy to see you. Anyway, yes, in many instances, isolation can, at least in the beginning of an outbreak, help. The problem is when the isolation becomes so much a part of how your response is to the disease that you're not figuring out how to handle the disease. You're not figuring out what do we do when it arrives. You're just depending on it not arriving. Not only because that's very unrealistic, but also because it then allows you to become a bit more kind of lax in how you prepare for it, how you train everyone to social distance, how you train everyone to wear masks. So when they are asked to do it, they feel like they're being told to do something negative, which we see here, right? I mean, we see here all the time. My 80-year-old father, who is a doctor, doesn't want to go out with a mask. He hates it. He hates the idea. I have to treat it that way. We all have these types of issues. It's just that it becomes much more problematic when you are in isolation for so long and you don't think it's going to come. And then it comes and people don't want to believe it. They don't want to act in a way that they're being told by the government because they're not trustful. And it in that way, isolation, while it can provide a short-term benefit, also offers a lot of harm very quickly.
Well, and to add to that, the smallpox that killed the Inca civilization didn't come when the people came. It came when the people sent blankets.
Mm-hmm.
well before the people arrived, the Europeans arrived, they sent gifts of blankets. And the disease in the blankets, and I just mentioned that because, you know, we now know that I guess we're supposed to be washing cans that come in from the grocery store, that the spread of the disease is way more than social distancing. And
Absolutely.
when you have these communities where a lot of material is being brought in, because it has to be brought in, then you have the potential, which is hard to understand, that the disease can come in on a can, even if there's a human being that doesn't come.
No, absolutely, but it can. And you are completely right, because this is the time of year now when a lot of communities, especially those in the farther north, in the fall, they will kind of go into hibernation. They will literally tuck in all of their provisions for the winter because they can't, even airplanes can't fly at certain temperatures. And with snow potential, it's just impossible. So the communities will keep all of their food, all of their supplies, their propane, whatever, together. And now when it starts to get warmer and the thaw starts, that's when you get the shipments coming back up again. And you get seasonal workers changing very quickly. And that's, again, you know, you don't think about it when you pick up the propane tank, but it's something that you assume just came up and it's safe, and it's not. Another issue with a lot of the areas that are Indigenous populated, especially again in Canada, but also in the US, is that they're close to mining areas. And so my friend, her name, she has a name, her name is Tara. She doesn't mind that I talk about her. She actually enjoys it. So there you go. Her significant other is a mechanic and works for 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off at, it's about 8 hours by car away at one of these big mining facilities. They keep all of the miners who come in and out, and all of the staff members who come in and out, in a segregated area outside the town, but then they go into the town for, you know, a night out or whatever, whatever they might want to do. They constantly cycle in and out. And so even if the community itself is subject to a strict lockdown, just by having that population there, and it's still deemed, mining is still deemed to be essential, so it's still going on, you know, every 3 weeks he's there and he's back. And what he's doing when he's home, you know, no one has control over. So it's not just immediately within that community, it's also somebody who goes home, gets infected, doesn't feel anything, comes home, goes to a bar to have a drink, and then, you know, that's that. Yeah.
We're getting short on time, but I wonder, Dr. Harrington, if you know you took part most recently in the Fulbright program, and it works a little bit different for more senior faculty and just sort of scholars. It's a little bit different than the student program, but I wonder if you could say a word or two just about the support for your research that you were able to get through Fulbright, and maybe some of the current students or admitted students or graduating students might be interested in just sort of some potential for international study, and sort of how that overlapped with some of your research on international treaties.
No, I would love to. I cannot say enough about the Fulbright program. As I explained to Professor Rayhan, I enjoyed it so much. I asked them if I could stay an extra year, and they said yes. So there you go. I didn't expect that answer, but that was that. No, whatever phase you're in, if you are an undergraduate student, because they do take undergraduate students, more junior and senior undergraduate, or a graduate student or a professional, it is such a wonderful opportunity. It is a very supportive program in terms of having a lot of different understandings of what research can be, and not necessarily being wedded to your one discipline. So my research is very interdisciplinary. It looks at governance and global governance. So it's law, but it's also treaty implementation, regulatory aspects that are not always legal, a lot of scientific aspects coming in from climate change. So there are a lot of different aspects of research, and many places don't support that, but Fulbright always does, and they pride themselves on that. They also create a very strong alumni network. So once you leave the program, you never really leave the program. I get emails every week. You can be an evaluator, you can be heavily involved with them, and they actually encourage you to wait a year or two after you do one, and then you're always eligible to reapply for another in another country, and they really want you to benefit from this program. And in fact, I just convinced a very dear family friend of mine who well, he's the son of a family friend, who's in school in Poland to apply to come to the US on a Fulbright, for the same reason of this real just interdialogue and exchange that you don't necessarily get with viewpoints at home. And sometimes you almost have to go outside to understand your own viewpoint because you test it against other people and you try other people's views and you see why they think what they think, and then you understand your own points better. So I honestly can't say enough about it. It really was wonderful. And if our current students or admitted students, if you ever have questions or if you're thinking about applying, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm happy to talk to you about it. It's really just a great program. And there are other places you can go than Canada in the winter, because I did question in January, sitting very close to Toronto, the wisdom of not going to, Fulbright Bahamas or something. I really did question that. So there are many other places you can go that don't involve snow and ice. Yes. Are we?
Yeah, so we actually don't have any more questions on chat. We don't have any more hands raised from a participant perspective. I think one thing that I just wanted to raise, many institutions and organizations do a statement or acknowledgement of Indigenous territory. So the folks who are in the Albany area or in the capital region, the law school is on the native lands of the Mohican Nation.
Yes.
There is just to share some info there. So to acknowledge the there's a website called native-land.ca that has that provides a mapping tool where you can find Indigenous population territory. So the screen I'm sharing right now is where the law school is. So just making that acknowledgement. And I guess Dr. Harrington, I don't know if you have anything to say sort of about that territorial acknowledgements, sort of how they're being used and how they might be able to spread the word or at least share some education with individuals, either in an institution setting like we're in now or otherwise.
No, absolutely. And it was interesting. It's last September when we were all able to gather in New York, together in a closed quarters. I was at one of the UN events that I speak at every year, and I was on an Indigenous rights panel, so we were talking about that topic and about the use of the attestations and the affirmations of these claims. And it really is so powerful. It's one of the most powerful things that we can have for anyone, whether they're lawyers, non-lawyers, children, adults, to understand just from a fundamental perspective what we're talking about. Because we're not saying, we acknowledge that we're on the lands of Mohicans at the law school, and we owe it all back and everything else, because that opens up all sorts of discussions of very costly and complex issues. But what we're doing is just highlighting the existence of the culture, its importance, the importance of it as a legal entity as well as a societal entity, and that it continues, and the descendants still continue to have a place in our legal system and our society that is special and that is different. And it really does act to educate people, but also to include people. And I think that's perhaps the most delicate balance that you could try to strike. And that's something that's really brilliant from the perspective of how these types of attestations work. So that's it. Thank you for bringing that up. I do appreciate that. Thank you.
That sounds like a perfect way to top our session. Professor Harrington, Dr. Harrington, thank you so very much for doing this for us. It was a great way to cap off at least the academic year. I see the names of a lot of people who've been with First Mondays from the first Monday on. And one of the things that Professor DeBarbieri and I, along with very helpful individuals who are here today as well from institutional advancement and IT and that sort of thing, is that we realize that because we're doing this way on the first Monday in May, we could actually do this way on the first Monday in June, July, and August. So one of the things that we would love to hear from especially from those of you who have been with us from the start, is if we're able to get experts during the summer, whether there are some issues or what issues you'd love to have examined at whatever opportunity, either next fall when we're hopefully in residence or through this particular medium before that. But thank you so much again to Dr. Harrington, and
Thank you.
for coming. Very appreciative.
Thank you all. And everyone, have good luck on exams. Have a great last day. Enjoy your summers to the extent that you can. We will all be back at some point, and I'll see each other at some point.
Look forward
Thank
to
you
it.
very much. Really.